what is an international public good? It's kind of a technical term, but essentially it's a solution to a shared problem, I think is a good rough way of describing what an international or a global public good is. A problem that transcends national boundaries. And there are a whole lot of examples you could give, but I think to choose a few that are particularly relevant for the panel of speakers that we have, most obviously climate change mitigation, which has come up again and again in the discussion in the first half of the day. Infectious disease control, of course. Regional infrastructure that provides connectivity between countries. The sustainable management of transboundary resources, whether it's oceanic fisheries or forests or fresh water for that matter. And the final one I'll mention is knowledge, which cuts across all of those areas and is also particularly important in relation to food security and agriculture. Those are just some examples of the kind of thing we're talking about. Now, in all of those areas, it's not feasible to operate within national boundaries. The development challenges in those areas don't respect national sovereignty. And the solutions to those problems are not within the control of individual countries. You can pump as much money as you like into a country, but there are some things that have to be dealt with beyond its borders. So that's the topic. Now, 4 quick comments on that topic. First, international public goods tend to be undersupplied, even by comparison with national public goods. They usually require countries to pool their resources in some way or to engage in policy cooperation, and that has to be done on a voluntary basis because there is no world government, there's no supranational authority with coercive powers. And for the really hard problems, which tend to be the most costly, most countries really have strong incentives to free ride on the actions of others, and therefore there is no collective will to act, and often no action. So that's the first comment. These public goods are undersupplied. The second comment is development agencies can, at least in principle, step in to help increase the supply of international public goods. And I'll explain in principle in a minute. They certainly can't do a whole lot about failures of policy cooperation, though they can support global and regional institutions that provide forums for policy discussion, such as, let's say, the Mekong River Commission, the Pacific Islands Forum. There are many examples. But development agencies can supply financing so that countries don't have to bear costs that don't uniquely benefit them. Now, I use that phrase in principle because there are some pretty significant barriers to the use of aid for international public goods. Now, I want to pick out 2 main ones. One has already been discussed a fair bit this morning. It's the donor concept of aid effectiveness as articulated in the Paris Declaration, the Accra Agenda for Action, and so on. That's a concept that gives primacy to ownership and alignment. Essentially, donors want to do what their partners want them to do, or at least that's what they say. That's the concept. Now, their partners, only very rarely want to spend scarce aid money on problems that extend beyond their borders. So that is clearly a barrier. It's a particular problem in relation to regional infrastructure, which I mentioned. And in that case, it's compounded by the fact that a lot of that infrastructure is loan financed, and lending institutions really have to know who is responsible for the repayments. So they deal with a sovereign government, and they have trouble dealing with a multiplicity of actors. So there are some sort of traditional barriers to aid financing for international public goods. You have the same problem with global public goods, but there's an additional factor there too, which is that there are moral objections to the use of aid in ways that end up benefiting donors. And those moral objections have led quite often for calls for aid for international public goods to be separate from and additional to ODA, and the point that Mark Purcell about climate financing in the Pacific. And also, there have been lots of suggestions for how you might achieve that separation and additionality through innovative financing mechanisms, including levies on international public bads. So that's my third point. There are barriers. The fourth point is that those ideas about mobilising separate and additional funding are gaining no traction whatsoever. Aid budgets are inevitably going to be used to a greater extent to finance international public goods. And there are several quite clear trends that support that statement. First, more traditional aid, and I think probably most philanthropic financing, let's say from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is already being used to finance international public goods. With the growth of vertical funds, the increase in climate change financing, it's happening, though quite below the radar in terms of public perceptions of aid. Secondly, particularly at a time of fiscal constraint, there are regular calls for donors to revisit and to broaden the concept of aid. It's happening now in the DAC context. There is work being undertaken this year on exactly that. And you know, the ultimate aim of people who want that to happen is that pretty much all non-commercial, non-military flows from developed to developing countries would in some sense be aid, and you might be talking about international public finance instead of ODA. And then thirdly, as we've heard again a number of times this morning, the pool of low-income countries is rapidly shrinking, and there is much greater competition among suppliers of aid to that shrinking pool of countries, all of which points to the likely increase in the use of traditional ODA for international public goods. So those are my sort of four general points. I want to turn over to the speakers now. We have slightly rejigged the order just to get some balance in the order of presentations. A couple of the speakers probably need a little bit more than 10 minutes, a couple of the speakers a little bit less, and we hope that will all even out. We aim to finish by 3 o'clock, so we're cutting this session a little bit short. We'll then have a half-hour tea break and commence the final session at 3:30 with the aim of finishing at about 5. So let me introduce our first speaker. Warren Evans is Senior Advisor for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. Until last year, Director of the Environment Department at the bank, instrumental in the creation of the Climate Investment Funds, and also a long career at the Asian Development Bank in the environment sector. So over to you, Warren.
Thanks, Robin. It's great to be here. Be nicer to be outside, but the sooner we get finished here, we get to go outside. Let me start off by saying that to thank Alice and my long-lost cousin, somewhere in Wales, I guess, for setting the stage for much of what I'm going to talk about. Many of the issues that were raised in the keynote this morning are very relevant to what I'm going to talk about. I also want to note that it's great to be on a panel with Kazu, who I worked with many, many years ago in ADB. We don't get to see each other very often, so it's nice to come to Melbourne to be able to have a glass of wine. I'm working now and have been for the last year on a study called Collective Solutions 2025. Now, this is a parting gift that the World Bank has given me before they kicked me out the door, to download a little bit of what I've learned in 35 years of working on environment and development, and about something I'm concerned about. And so my concern is the following. I've seen over my career a move from very supply-driven, donor-driven development assistance to very demand-driven development, recipient-driven, local, country-owned development assistance. Great move. Huge shift of the pendulum, exactly what was needed. The problem I see is that there's been little room left in the development dialogue, particularly over the last 10 years, to address some of the regional and global long-term issues that have tremendous impacts on whether or not the development assistance that's taking place and the development activities that are taking place at the country and local level are indeed sustainable. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about, in particular, I'll focus on climate change. I call that the woolly mammoth in the room. It is bigger than an elephant in the room now. The more we learn, the bigger it gets. The arguments that I will have relate to a number of other issues, fisheries or many of the air quality and water issues that are transboundary and so on. But I'm going to focus to a large extent on climate change. The question that we're asking, and Robin, I'm very fortunate that Robin's working with me on this study, is there an adequate balance between the local, sometimes rather short-term focus of development versus the regional, global, and often necessary long-term focus of development? Is there an adequate balance? And if the answer to this is no, then a question that has to be raised is the one that we've been talking about here this morning, which is what role does ODA play, and does it need to change? So in starting this work, we looked at what does 2025 look like? And it's amazing how much work in the last 2 years has been futuristic, thinking about 2025, 2030, and so on. It's absolutely astounding. Much of it comes from the security, the side of security of, the CIAs of this world looking at future scenarios. But basically, if I'm looking at it from the World Bank side, I see a couple of things immediately. One is our clientele is going to change. We talked about IDA this morning or poor countries that are graduating from IDA. The Center for Global Development estimates that by 2025, probably half the countries that are eligible for IDA today will have graduated, and that will result in about 1/3 of the population remaining eligible because some of the biggest Asian countries will have graduated. So IDA changes dramatically. IBRD, the more better known sometimes arm of the World Bank, it's hard to imagine that China, Mexico, Brazil, and maybe South Africa, some of our biggest borrowers today, it's hard to imagine that in 2025 they're going to be major borrowers. So our clientele is going to change dramatically by 2025, number one change. ODA, is it going to change? That discussion is almost irrelevant now. It's already changed. It's not just about the emerging donors, and I'll try and avoid calling it that now after the lesson we just got. But it's about philanthropic donors. It's the whole non-traditional donor community, plus climate finance. And this idea that Robin just raised on new and additional, there is no new and there is no additional. Climate finance that are commitments from most of the donor countries are going to come from the same pot that ODA has been coming from. So climate finance has a big impact. And if you don't agree with me on this, watch the next 6 months. IDA is being negotiated, the GEF replenishment's being negotiated, and the Green Climate Fund is being negotiated. The results of those negotiations for all three of those replenishments and the initial funding for GCF are going to be very telling, I think, over the coming year. If we look at scenarios, the economic growth scenarios are key. As I mentioned, IDA graduation's a good indication. But I want to focus on urban growth as well. So Asia, looking in our backyard here, right now urban population of about 1.9 billion. It's going to be 3.3 billion by about 2050. India will add 497 million urbanites, China 341, Indonesia 92 million urbanites between now and 2050. As Allison mentioned, the McKinsey folks estimate there will be about 600 million new consumers. Basically what this means is there'll be folks who have enough discretionary income that they will be able to buy a whole lot of things other than what meeting their basic needs. And these folks are going to want, most of them are going to be in cities. Most of them are going to be in cities in Asia. They're going to want cars. They're going to want to have a steak. They're going to want to have some tuna, and they're going to want to have some good Australian wine to go with it. And I don't blame them. Consumption patterns are going to change very, very dramatically over the coming 10, 15, 20 years. And that's going to have a huge impact on things. A great statistic, and I don't question me on this, go question McKinsey because they came up with this one. But the new floor space that China will require is equal to, by 2025, is equal to 85% of the existing stock globally. It's big enough to cover Australia. That's how much floor space is going to be built. And that's going to be built out of concrete, and it's going to be built out of steel. Steel and concrete combined generate about 10% of the world's global greenhouse gas emissions. So, all these things start coming together. The risks are huge. The financial crisis, the food crisis, climate crisis. Interesting thing on climate is that until recently, and officially, even today, we talk as if we're going to have a 2-degree world, because there was a political agreement in Copenhagen a few years ago that we're going to have a 2-degree world. Well, I don't know what those folks have been smoking, but it's not going to be a 2-degree world. It's going to be something much worse. And in fact, current commitments, if you just look at current commitments, we're looking at least a 3.5-degree world, centigrade world, by the end of this century. And based on current trajectories, by 2060, we're looking at a 4-degree world. And with that, I'd like to just run a real quick little clip here. Thanks. I wanted to show that because it does a better job than I can of trying to express what a 4-degree world means. We've had discussions on climate change parallel to development, and that's silly. This is a development issue. It's a critical development issue. The gains that were discussed this morning in poverty reduction and economic growth will be lost very, very quickly in many of the poorest countries, the ones that we're talking about graduating by 2025. Not only will they not graduate, or they may graduate and then slip back, but many other countries that have been in middle income status for a long, long time that are highly vulnerable to climate impacts are likely to also slip back into low income status. Central America is a very good example of some very highly vulnerable areas. What does this mean now for the subject here? Let me just, I'm gonna skip some numbers because I think we'll focus on ODA and how it relates to dealing with this problem, which it hasn't yet in my view. I'd like to focus on cities. So cities are 70% of the problem. GHG emissions are generated from, about 70% of GHG emissions are emitted from cities, and many cities are very, very highly vulnerable to climate impacts. In Asia, low-lying cities have about 410 million people living today in very highly vulnerable cities. These cities are going to develop. The numbers that Allison talked about earlier and I just mentioned in terms of city growth, it will happen. One of two things is going to happen. They're either going to develop with very high carbon technologies and lock us into a very high carbon future in those cities, or with some effort and some additional money, we can see a very quick transition towards low carbon. And in my view, it is at the city level where we might actually be able to do something about this challenge and move it back from a 4-degree world much closer to a 2-degree world. And we're focused very much on that. There was a great study recently done on New York City that showed that New York City can from 2010 levels, could reduce their GHG emissions by 90% by 2050. That's a huge, huge reduction in GHG emissions. And the interesting thing is that the rate of return, the financial rate of return on much of that is actually pretty high. The challenge is, how do you get the financing for these kinds of investments? If we try and use ODA, and if we get over the argument ODA shouldn't be used for climate finance, that's a separate thing, and then we never have enough money to do anything well on either side. If we can get over that argument and focus on where ODA ought to go, or ODA-like funding should go in terms of dealing with this problem, the first thing you realize is that we cannot tackle this scale of problem using project finance. It just won't work. This isn't about doing projects, and it's not, particularly it's not about using public sector international development assistance for projects. So what can ODA do to change this scenario? The question we've been asking in the World Bank and with a number of partners is, can ODA and ODA-like money actually be shifted to be used in a direction that actually loosens up serious levels of private sector finance so that we can mobilize the kind of resources required to deal with the urban problem. And we're talking about somewhere around $1.3 trillion a year over the next 20 to 30 years to actually make this happen. So these are big numbers. The money is largely in institutional investors, the pension funds, the sovereign funds, and so on. And those folks, we've had many discussions with them, and it's very simple for them. You just need to meet 3 criteria, and they'll gladly put money in. Number one, the investment has to, or the partner has to be creditworthy. The investment has to have liquidity, and the return on the investment has to be competitive with the other stuff that they do. Well, that's real nice, except none of those conditions generally apply in most developing country cities where these investments need to be made, and I am focusing on developing countries here. So what do we do about that? How do we mobilize these resources so that from institutional investors and others? There's very little evidence to date that group of institutional investors is going to move out of an altruistic nature towards the middle to try and loosen up their conditions for putting large volumes of funding into financing low-carbon cities. So the question is, can ODA-like money, be used to mitigate the risks that those folks see in the investments that we're talking about, so that it can be mobilized? We've had a number of discussions with donor partners, and they're equally immobile for the very same reasons that were discussed this morning, that they want they want a very clear return on the investment, development return on the investment. They want to be able to explain it to the taxpayers, understandably. And my experience is that the traditional donor community is as risk averse as the institutional investment community. So we have a huge, huge problem right now. There's a huge gap, and there is no answer yet. But in addressing the question, does ODA have to change? In my view, it absolutely has to change. It has to be able to move towards the middle and actually take higher risks with larger volumes of money, do innovative things, quit worrying about whether guarantee facilities count as ODA or not. That's a big issue for some donors. We've got to get over some of these issues that have been hanging on for about the last 10 years and getting in the way of being much more innovative with the way we use ODA. If we don't do this, then I am afraid that we're looking at a 3.5 to 4 degree world, and that's frightening for all of us. So I think the challenge is very much in the hands of the donor community. Institutions like the World Bank need to step up. ADB needs to step up. We need to come up with some really new, innovative ways of attracting the financing to deal with global public goods, and in particular with climate change. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Warren, and we should have given you a viewer warning that some of those scenes might disturb people. I'll introduce now Graham Brown, who needs very little introduction. Graham is the mastermind of this event and has been flogging the rest of us relentlessly for weeks to bring this together, and has done a great job. You're all aware that he's Foundation Director of the Nossal Institute for Global Health, and many of you will know that Graham is also very active on the international scene, both in Papua New Guinea, in Africa, and serves on the board of the Rollback Malaria Initiative, among many other hats. So, Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robin. The comments at the beginning about a professor, for the overseas visitors, Australia is one of the few places where academic is a derogatory term. So some of my friends in business who are professors delete the term. It shall never be mentioned in open conversation. So thank you for bringing that to everyone's attention, Robin, making me feel even smaller. Well, after such a wonderful talk from Ron, I'd be happy to stop my talk and hear more on climate change. But Robin did put this into context for us about aid and international public goods. And as he said, it's a solution to shared problems. And there's no doubt that infectious diseases are a very good example of where these are shared problems and we need shared solutions. And there's no doubt that we need these mechanisms and coordinating mechanisms of various sorts to deal with emerging infections or epidemic infectious diseases. And I thought of making the whole talk about the response to SARS and the economic consequences of that, but felt that I would just confine my remarks to malaria. And what we'll be saying is that it's really important for global public goods, but also at a regional level. The question I'd like to raise during my talk is, how can the benefits, the investments we use to benefit the most vulnerable communities, and how would it be measured? And in fact, the same question could have been asked with respect to climate change that Warren just said then. You made the point that the poorest, most vulnerable are most affected, and do the solutions address the most vulnerable wherever they may be? And that's what I'll be suggesting in response to malaria. I won't spend a lot of time on malaria, but obviously mosquitoes know no borders as they go to seek their blood meals to lay their next set of eggs. If you then look in our region, we'll find that there is a high region, and on this side we've got deaths per 10,000 people, on this the number of cases. And if you do it in that regard, and the size of the blobs represents the absolute number of cases. So you have in our region Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and Solomons, which have very high rates of malaria, but their populations are relatively small. But of course in Papua New Guinea, despite a small population, there's still quite a large amount, with that the size indicator there of 2.5 million cases. So there are large burdens in India and Indonesia, even though the rate per 1,000 people is relatively low. But they're context specific, and each perhaps requires different solutions. So the global burden of malaria in 2010, 3.5 billion people at risk. Of course, of the high-risk people are mainly in Africa, but of low risk, they're particularly in our region. And of course, there are huge secondary effects of malaria that we won't go into now. Poor health interferes with development, and certain estimates have been made the extent to which malaria reduces development and effect on GDP. But particularly the burden is on women and their children. And if these are priorities for aid programs, it's particularly important. And of those, I like Jimmy's figures about 3 jumbo jets crash. It would be a headline, but that's the number of women that die in childbirth in Papua New Guinea each year. And a proportion of those presumably would die during pregnancy in relation to malaria, which is an important cause of preventable maternal deaths. But just like the talks that we've heard today about poverty, I'd like you to look at this map because it's going to be a moving picture in a moment. So this is changes from 2000 to 2010, in which there's been really a substantial reduction in the number of cases and deaths. And I would like you to note particularly the country of Sri Lanka, which is here, which, as shown here, has 10 to 50 cases per 1,000 population in 2010. Just watch at the yearly changes. Green means it's good and red means it's bad. So obviously Central Africa is pretty bad, as is Papua New Guinea. And watch what happens over the next 10 years. So we'll see reduction across the world, an absolutely major reduction in cases, such that we estimate there are now probably only 700,000 deaths, and only a proportion of those in this region. But I would draw your attention to Sri Lanka, because here's an example. There's practically no cases occurring at the moment in Sri Lanka. Our big challenge is we learn from history. There was a global malaria eradication campaign in the 50s. In 1946, the sprays which are used in houses to kill off mosquitoes that have just fed and stops malaria being transmitted to the next human. Death rate fell, and by 1956, rather than 3 million cases, they went to 7,300 and no deaths, getting close to the situation that we're back to now. In 1964, let's stop our measures. Within the space of 5 years, there was resurgent, cases rising from 17 to 500,000. And then malaria became a major problem in Sri Lanka, as it did in India at that time. Hence our enormous concern at the moment that this map could go backwards. The great advances have come through the golden era, as it were, of donations to things like the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria, civil society saying there should be no deaths from preventable disease, input from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But if we go backwards in a very rapid way, as the Sri Lanka example shows. So how do we have a solution to a shared problem that's defined as a public good? The Rollback Malaria Partnership is groups of foundations, multilaterals, donors, endemic countries, NGOs, private sector, research and academia, working together to try and find solutions to these particular problems. And it's been going for some considerable time, and it's been assisted naturally in the work of all partners because of the substantial input to funding. And it is estimated that funding's really dropped off in the last 2 years, those that follow the Global Fund, for example, and hard choices need to be made now about maintaining the gains or having new things to happen. And in light of Warren's example with the change in climate, it's quite likely that malaria would become even worse. So why not try and attack it now and get rid of it? Although we say we need 5 or 6 billion per year, that's absolutely trivial compared with some of the sums of money that are being spent on other things. I won't go through public goods, but this is to remind me that the public goods that one requires for malaria are not just about health, because if we can improve knowledge, improve conditions generally for people, we know this will also lead to reduced malaria. So we think that what we'd want is particularly surveillance and control for action to arise from the international public good, and it could be coordinated with current structures, but I'm going on to say I think we may need some new ones and should be available to all. And if we look at that then, the things that are happening through RBM, for example, we try and say that there should be one coordinating mechanism. We need the research for evidence, we need coordination so that it can happen in a coordinated way. But then the complementary aspects of the international public good are the implementation costs. And this is where, as health people, those questions about access, equity and financing, and then of course to national or regional public goods. I'd like to take it back, however, though, to this woman who has a bed net over her bed as she's in the maternity ward in an African hospital. The stratospheric talk about public goods and rollback malaria in New York and Geneva. What does that mean for the woman in her small village in somewhere in Papua New Guinea, for example? How does that get translated to benefit? It's a public good, should be available to all, but how to ensure it? Particularly from a health perspective, the socio-economic determinants of health are so important, education so important, so many things, and who benefits? Just to give one example, it's recognised that a lot of children die from malaria and are not being treated in the public sector. It's very important to have good quality medicines in the private sector, not counterfeit, proper doses and so on. So our initiative was a facility to support sale of anti-malarial drugs in the private sector. Some of the analyses, not yet all published, suggest, yes, there was a lot more drugs sold, numbers look good, but much of it went to people who didn't actually need anti-malarial drugs in the cities, easy access. So did it achieve its goal of reducing illness and death from malaria? Probably a bit, but had it been targeted to those at most risk, it would have been having greater input. So I would argue then that we need the surveillance and control, the structures, but it has to be available to all. It really tends to be from above, and we're looking for things from the society and the community going up. So it does require the local and national effort to engage the communities, because successful malaria programs, it's really engaged at the community level where many of the NGOs do their very best work. Rotary Against Malaria, for example, many other organisations, and we don't want anyone to left behind. But it is harder to measure the impact. It's easy to say how many bed nets went through ports, but much harder to say how many women who were pregnant actually slept under a bed net the previous night. But then I'd like to talk about a regional strategy, and we won't obviously go to detail because some even Warren mentioned, but it goes without saying. I draw attention to, this is a slide from the Executive Director of Rollback Malaria. And normally what you hear is technical things about malaria. But here at this meeting, the Executive, she drew attention to why do we need a regional strategy. And if you look at it, transport and economic development, cross-border developments, migration in and across Greater Mekong sub-region countries, all of these things are fantastic for development, but certainly also very important ways of increasing the malaria from place to place. Another example, everybody knows through the Asian Development Bank descriptions here about this huge project, the new Special Economic Zone, infrastructure investments of 50 billion. It'll be absolutely huge as we know it's coming. But if a regional strategy is required, the point is, how do we manage that strategy here in this region? How do those countries work together? Now, if you saw an international public good of somehow getting a regional working together, but we've heard of different philosophies about how this is done. And in essence, if we're stopping malaria trafficking across borders, it can even be country to country or even province to province where the thing is occurring, which is quite interesting. If you go back to the first of the international health regulations 100 years ago, there were sanitary requirements to reduce, say, quarantinable diseases. So that was a border-to-border, an international rather than the global look at things. And it's interesting that we have a global strategy perhaps, but at that individual level there's going to be national, but we'd like to see it as regional. And we've heard about the way new partners in the region work may not see the global, but may be looking for interactions of each of these little pieces between their country and the neighbour. It's a huge challenge to say, how do we deal with regional, particularly where there are cross-border issues? So we can have, for example, some of the fake drugs, we know where they're coming from, but how do we control them? Substandard drugs are leading, one of the reasons that we're getting resistance to some of the best combinations. And we've got particular problem for this drug artemisinin that was developed in China, and the red spots are just some of the spots where resistances have occurred. And where this has occurred, there's really no satisfactory alternative. So not only is it it's important where it is happening right now, so countries want to spread it, but if that's spread to India, and particularly if it's spread to Africa, the deaths could rocket up. We've seen it before. Nearly always drug resistance starts in our region with all the drugs that you've probably all had, your chloroquine, your Fansidar, your mefloquine. The resistance began in this region and away it moved. What's the mechanism that we have some sort of global public good that deals with a problem like this? And I don't think we've really got very good mechanisms to deal with it. So I think the challenges here that I've tried to outline, a good example of an international public good. We need a global public good, but of course there's need for regional and then national strategy for those information systems and sharing of data that provides there for the activities which will put it into place. But the question is, what about the cross-sectoral approaches? And then, of course, the question I raised in my first slide, how do we tackle that issue of inequality to ensure, although the public good's available to all, how do we make to ensure, particularly the most vulnerable, are able to benefit from it and have the opportunity to access? And how can we work together in the post-2015 era for this to happen? Different ways of working. How do we have, let's say that some of the Asian countries want to work with AUSAID. I think Rod Brazier mentioned around malaria in New Guinea was the example he gave. We've heard different ways of working. Where's the common ground for that to happen? Perhaps we need some different mechanisms to engage new and old contributors to these issues. Thank you very much.
Good. Thanks very much, Graham. I hope that mosquito goes away shortly. Now I'd like to introduce Dermot O'Gorman, who took up his position in 2010 as CEO of WWF Australia. Dermot has worked for WWF in Fiji. China has a very broad perspective on regional and global conservation challenges. So Dermot, over to you.
Good. Thanks very much, Robin. So I thought that I would talk about global public goods, but unfortunately Warren has stolen a lot of my thunder. So I'm going to quickly skim through a couple of probably complementary thoughts on global public goods, and then I think tell you two stories about which I think encapsulate part of the problem of working on the ground based on a couple of my experiences of living and working in China and the Pacific for the past decade. And then a little bit of a reflection on global governance and particularly the challenge of financing. Last year, the OECD came up with its 2050 Environmental Outlook report, a good report which looked at the state of the world's planet and, not surprisingly, said humanity has experienced unprecedented growth and prosperity. That's had environmental impacts, but it concludes, and I'll read the quote here because I think it's important, that the current growth model and mismanagement of natural assets could ultimately undermine human development. Now, you'd probably expect someone from WF to say that. You might even expect someone from Warren, who's in the bank but has an environmental remit, to say that. But when you have finance ministers from probably one of the most conservative economic institutions in the world saying that, I think it is cause to sit back and think, how do we start to address the global public goods issue? Now, there's lots of things that have been driving that, population doubling. From when DAC first started in the 50s, we've doubled our population, but over the same period, we've more than doubled humanity's footprint. So we call this the ecological footprint of humanity, and we've been measuring it since the 1960s. And what we've seen is that over that period, we've moved from consuming about 0.7% of the planet's natural renewable resources to consuming about 1.8. So we like to say that if we were farmers, we'd be eating a little bit of the seeds that we were meant to be sowing next year to grow our crops. And so thinking it like that means, how do we start to tackle some of the big problems in the world, food, water, and energy security, where FAO says we need to produce 50 or 60% or increase productivity to meet the growing demands of humanity through to 2050. But last year, Professor Jorgen Randers, who wrote a book called 2052, a forecast, and he was one of the original authors of Limits to Growth back in 1974. He said that we have the capacity to feed 9 billion people, or approximately 9 billion people, by 2050. The problem will be that in doing that, we will run down the environmental asset that we have and degrade it significantly. Secondly, we may have the ability to feed it, but it will be only to those that can afford it. So there will be a whole group that just won't be able to afford the food that we can produce. And lastly, that the negative consequences of running down that environmental asset will be most felt by the poorest in communities around the world. So I thought I'd give you two examples of how I see this playing out. And Dr. Rogers from SPC this morning told part of my story, so I think it helps. So I was going to talk about tuna fisheries in the Pacific. Outside of aid and outside of remittance, for quite a few, as I think Dr. Rogers was talking about, tuna often is one of the only sources of external income into these communities and to these economies. And as a secondary point, inshore fisheries is probably the principal source of protein for many of these communities as well. But Dr. Rogers talked about tuna being a gold mine, and the problem I have with tuna being a gold mine is gold mines cause gold rushes, and gold mines cause boom and busts eventually. And so I think we've got to think differently about tuna in the Pacific of here's a long-term source of income for Pacific Island communities where we have two big problems. A, we're unable to retain the value of that natural asset into Pacific Island communities. The fact that they retain 2 to 3%-ish of the value of that tuna as it goes and lands in Japan is not equitable and is not driving a sustainable Pacific Island country. The second one, which Dr. Rogers talked about, is climate change will move currents around the Pacific. It will change the temperatures of various parts of the Central and Western Pacific. That will move the spawning grounds and the nurseries of those tuna stocks. Now, he talked about them moving between Pacific Island country EEZs, and that will happen. But what I think is equally important is it will move it from Pacific Island EEZs out into international waters where it will become a global public good. And so we'll see an increasing drive to of everyone from the Europeans to the US to the East Asian countries going in there to collect what is a public good at the detriment to Pacific Island countries. The other little bit here is, of course, climate change will also change inshore fisheries. If we get up to 3+ degrees, coral cover changes significantly. Now, there may be some coral, the science says there may be some corals that will be able to be tolerant in some parts of the world, but that's a good debate. But I think that what we do know is that dependence on inshore fisheries for protein will be threatened if we get to a 3+ degree world. The other example is in rural China, and I thought we had an excellent presentation today by some Mr. Sun or Dr. Sun. China has done a remarkable job of lifting a huge number of rural Chinese out of poverty. They have invested enormous amounts in rural energy in the broader sense. So that's everything from hydropower to biogas, biofuels, particularly solar water heating, and increasingly wind and PV solar. And that has enabled them to transform the lives of villagers, benefiting everything from women in terms of who were often the principal harvesters of wood or cooking fuels and things like that. But you know that story better than me. What China have also been able to do is they've been able to cluster those projects in rural China into packages that they can then sell into the CDM market and bring and link that back to particularly the European carbon markets. So they've been able to cluster that in many least developing countries, the ability to A, put that technology in place, and B, then cluster them in a way that's cost effective to get private carbon financing into, or market carbon financing into those communities is probably non-existent in the short term. So I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn out of China, and you will note that Mr. Sun talked about renewable energy being one of the important strategies of investing into Africa. And I know, having lived there, there's a lot of thought going on by the Chinese community as to how they may do that, because China will produce the vast majorities, particularly in the short term, of renewable energy products, and they have the technology and experience of putting low-cost solutions into rural China, which they'll be able to export. So I think that's a fabulous opportunity to China to use its expertise and resources to be able to bring a solution to Africa or other countries as well. So I think we should be embracing China and being able to work in partnership with them. And I certainly think that the collaboration that AusAid, Minister Bob Carr signed last month, is a leadership that Australia is playing along with the British in terms of working collaboration with the Chinese. So a few thoughts on governance and financing, and I'll probably be short as here because I suspect I have even more questions than I have answers. Part of this problem is living in a democratic and capitalist society, we are plagued by a short-termism that the political cycle and the discount rate, which for most any environmental good is less than 5 years, means we're unable to plan for any global public goods out past the 5-year period. Having worked in China, there is a different proposition because they are able to take a longer term viewpoint. And I think there are equally some lessons out of that are worth thinking through, putting aside some of the downsides of how China works as well. Warren mentioned what I call the twin tracks, which is the whole MDG process and the Rio Plus 5, 10, 20 process, or sustainable development. And I think that's something that's been going on for 40 plus years. And I hope that during the next post-MDG 2015 debate, we're able to move away from MDGs and the SDGs and move towards just one thing that starts to bring together the complexity of the problem we need to challenge. Regional options, I think, are really important. The Coral Triangle, which is a regional initiative led by 5-6 countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and its area stretches from Malaysia, Indonesia, across to PNG and Solomons. Led by those leaders, supported by the Asian Development Bank, with work from the World Bank and many aid agencies, is a way of being able to look at a regional global public good, which includes fisheries, and being able to try and put a framework that supports those countries to manage the geographical complexities of managed fish stocks and things, and tackling climate change. And I think that, just to conclude, that as there has been a lot of talk about doing aid differently, I certainly see, when I was working in China, an increasing understanding about and openness for them to engage with the real community, with the global development community on aid issues. And as we've heard this morning, an increasing opportunity and openness of aid agencies in the DAC community to engage China and India in this debate. And I think the colleague from India who spoke this morning says India doesn't want to be a rule taker, it wants to be a rule giver. I think is probably on the harsher end of, in fact, I think what everybody needs to do is move towards having a common set of rules which they all own, rather than having the Indians and Chinese and some of the other BRIC countries feeling like they're on the outer of a club that's been around for 50 years. So, a bit provocative, but I thought I'd finish on that. So thank you very much.
Good, thanks very much, Dermot. And finally, Kazu Sakai, as many of you will know, is head of the Policy and Strategy Department at the Asian Development Bank. Kazu is responsible essentially for long-term strategic thinking within the bank, but also responsible for resource mobilisation and therefore thinking about the future of the Asian Development Fund, among other things. And previously was Deputy Director General of the Mekong Department, which is an area where the bank has made particular contributions on regional public goods. Kazu.
Thank you, Robin. Actually, Robin asked me to focus on regional public goods issue, but after listening to other speakers, including Robin himself, and after reading excellent background materials, I cannot resist to temptation for saying something about broader issue of aid and international public goods. Because I understand from background note and also what Robin said in this session, there is a dichotomy between global versus national, and also public goods versus poverty reduction. And I think this is true, and the barriers that Robin mentioned earlier are really true. Barriers for global issue is focus on national priority in aid architecture, and also when matter comes to climate change, this issue of moral obligation. So I accept this, but at the same time, I think it's not black and white. There are some ambiguity. For example, if you think about health as look at health issue from global public goods point of view, where already Alison and Professor Brown mentioned about focused approach for some diseases, which had very good results. But for example, if we think about vaccination, yes, activities focused on vaccination at the global level is very important, but probably effectiveness is greater if in each country there is a good national health system. So it's very difficult to completely separate national and global. Also, climate change and poverty. If you look at poverty from very narrow poverty reduction perspective, and if you think that our action for poverty reduction should be always directly targeted at the poor, yes, there is such a dichotomy. But if you think about poverty reduction from broader perspective, and if you think that actually, in the case of Asia, the main driving factor for spectacular reduction in poverty in the past decade or so was strong economic growth, then perspective changes. Because if you think about economic growth as one of the major forces for poverty reduction, then we have to think about consequences of economic growth, impact on environment, inequality issue. Then we have to look at poverty reduction from broader perspective. And inevitably, poverty reduction activities will include activities to address other issues. For example, last year, Asian Development Bank approved more than $3 billion of projects related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Now, out of this $3 billion, only very small fraction, I think about 5–6%, was financed by funds available outside of ADB, global funds for climate change. But the remaining part was our regular resources for our client countries. So here again, it's very difficult to completely separate global public goods and national poverty reduction issues. So now let me move to regional public goods. And I have one map, and I thought this map is new to you, but actually we already saw a similar map in Professor Brown's presentation. I'd like to use an example of Greater Mekong sub-region as a good example of countries working together for regional public goods. As Robin said, very often it's very difficult to convince national government to undertake regional projects which will benefit maybe to that country itself, but more to neighboring countries. But this has been working quite well in the countries that you are seeing in this map. By the way, northern part of this map is part of China. So this program is a joint program of 6 countries: Cambodia, China, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. In the case of China, it's a full member, but geographical coverage is only those southern areas sharing border with the other countries. Now, if you think about these countries, when I was still young, when I was still a student, this was really an area of conflict. After the end of Vietnam War, there was a war between China and Vietnam. After the collapse of Pol Pot regime, Vietnam invaded Cambodia. There was a constant armed conflict between Laos and Thailand, Myanmar and China. And even today, we are seeing the news about territorial conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. So these are the countries yesterday fighting each other. But one day they realized if they join their hands and work together, they can jointly bring in much more prosperity to all of them. And this thinking helped them start this program. And the map that you are seeing state of infrastructure, regional infrastructure linking these countries in 1992. Now, thanks to joint activities in 2009, this was the situation, much more improvement in connectivity. And this is what is expected 2 years from now. So it is very challenging, but once they realize that by working together and expand regional connectivity, which will help them to become important production base through value chain, also important destination for investment and trade. So when there is a will, they can do it. And infrastructure development is not only physical undertaking. When we worked on connectivity through transport network, they also worked on measures to facilitate cross-border movement of people and goods. And they have now what they call cross-border transport agreement, under which procedures at customs and other cross-border checking point process has been much more simplified. Now, so this is one good example. Okay, let me close this. Okay, but there are other examples. For example, when we tackled with the question of how then we can finance infrastructure. Of course, we can use aid money and other money, but to use countries' own resources is probably more important. And we noted, or they noted, that many of countries in Asia have enormous amount of foreign currency reserves. But foreign currency reserves are kept by central banks and cannot be easily invested in development projects. So here, not this Mekong group, but including this group, but a larger group of ASEAN, plus China, Japan, and Korea, recently they came up with a scheme called ASEAN Infrastructure Fund. And the ultimate purpose of this fund is to tap foreign currency reserves to invest in infrastructure. And the design of this fund is that first they establish fund, and each government put in equity money into it, and they also asked ADB to contribute. And after operating by investing the money into some projects, then they will try to get credit rating in the market from rating agencies. And if they succeed in getting AA rating, then they will become eligible for investment by central banks, and they can tap a huge amount of foreign currency reserve. So this is another example of regional efforts to finance regional public goods. Finally, if I cite another example, not only infrastructure, but communicable disease and other regional public goods issue, and probably financial safety net is also important regional public goods. And here, many ASEAN countries learned very severe lesson from 1997-98 Asian financial crisis. So after that, and realizing that they cannot really rely on World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, they decided to build up their own safety net, and they started an initiative called Chiang Mai Initiative. And at the beginning, this was a series of bilateral currency swap exchange, so that if one country gets into trouble, others can provide foreign currency. But more recently, this has made into a genuine multilateral system. Also size increased. And finally, more recently, they established dedicated office to carry out surveillance. This office is located in Singapore. So it's almost like mini IMF, regional IMF. So this is another example of regional public goods for financial safety. And institutions like World Bank, like Asian Development Bank, we can play an important role in these undertakings. Of course, most important is decision by countries, their political will. But as they have a lot of issues among themselves, presence of neutral party like us will help in sort of mitigating difficult issues among themselves. So we call it role of honest broker. We can also provide technical support in designing program projects. And finally, we can provide financing, or we can help them raise financing from others. So this is one important area, I believe, for multilateral institutions like us in pursuing international public good, and particularly for regional bank like us for regional public goods. Before closing, I'd like to touch upon a question about the G20. I think some speaker this morning mentioned, and also background materials given to us from organizer talked about the G20. G20, if you think about the role of G20 in international public goods, I don't think G20 can, for example, replace UN and other existing arrangement in handling global public goods issue. But one area probably is not really handled by other mechanisms. It's, again, infrastructure, regional infrastructure. And G20, we saw quite important role played by G20 at the time of 2008-2009 crisis. In that crisis, G20 got together and sent message to us. Us means multilateral banks, World Bank and other regional banks, that we should strengthen our capital and increase our lending so that more funds can be given to developing countries for them to carry out counter-cyclical fiscal expansion program. Because that crisis was not caused by a structural problem of these developing countries, but it was a kind of external shock coming from US and Europe. So what was important was undertaking counter-cyclical measures rather than undertaking structural reform, and they needed money. And this decision by G20, this message from G20 really helped all of us, World Bank and other regional banks, to achieve capital increase and provide more funds to developing countries. So I thought G20 is very effective new sort of international, how can I say it, new element of international governance. But unfortunately, since then, we have not seen much impact coming from G20. And I think still G20 can play a bigger role if they, well, in the area of development, if they focus on some critical issue. And I think this question of regional infrastructure is a good issue for G20 to look at. And also another observation is that G20 identified certain number of issues and give recommendation. But usually they say, we give recommendations, but don't expect us to bring in money. That is another problem. So even for small scale, if they can match up their ideas with money, for example, for regional infrastructure, despite some successful cases, huge needs are there. And probably public money is not enough to finance these regional infrastructure projects. Involvement of private sector is very important. But for private sector to come in, there is a lot of preparation required. Good design of the project, identification of different risks, allocation of different risks, and mechanism to handle these risks. And for undertaking this kind of preparatory activities, a lot of money is needed. So if G20 countries do not provide money to finance projects themselves, at least probably they can provide some seed money to create a facility to prepare projects so that we can tap private money in better way. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kazu, and obviously Australia will fix that little G20 problem next year. So through collective action, I think we're not doing too badly on time. We've got around 10 minutes for questions, and I'm hoping we can just push that a little bit, Graham, if that's all right with you, if we go into the tea break. Okay. All right, I don't believe you. All right, we might take about 15 minutes or so for questions, and we might collect 3 or so at a time. So, Garth.
Thanks. Garth Luke, World Vision. Warren, what sort of dollars are we talking about in relation to using aid to leverage effective private investment to challenge 4 degrees? And what does that mean in terms of sectoral takes from the aid, from existing aid? What sort of sectors would that money be coming from? Thanks.
Chris Hort.
Thanks, Robin. I'd just like to reflect a little on this, going back to the starting point of international and regional public goods. I think sometimes we get a bit taken away by the word goods. When we think about regional public goods and international public goods, it sounds like they're good. But actually we're using the word goods in that term, not meaning whether they're good or bad in terms of their effect, but goods as in the terms of goods and services. So I think as we talk about regional and international public goods, and we had a range of examples there, we need to separate out and think how good are they and for whom. So the examples that Mr. Sakai was talking about in terms of regional infrastructure, those roads and communications, yes, they might be good, but who are they good for? Which parts of the population are benefiting from that? And as Graham was saying, what are the other potential risks that arise from that? So I guess as we're thinking there are regional and international public goods, and are these something that ODA might invest in? Well, one of the questions that investment by ODA needs to think about is who is actually benefiting from these so-called goods, and indeed who is paying the cost of them.
Thanks, Chris. Now there's a question at the back. Oh, it's Helen. Yeah.
Thanks very much. This is a completely different question, so I hope you're keeping track of all of the questions. And it's partly to Warren, but maybe to other members of the panel as well. All of the initiatives around, cooperation and, taking a regional focus and looking at cross-border issues, I guess the element of the discussion that hasn't been brought into play is the P word, and that's politics, the different political structures, and particularly if you look at, for example, the Mekong area and the nature of the differences between those governments, and yes, there have been great advances, but there are also great challenges. So my question is, in the context of all of the things that all of the speakers have spoken about, what are the kind of levers that can be used to encourage, I guess, a common interest to be seen across political lines, beyond, or maybe it is just economic development, and whether there are any examples of that the speakers might want to allude to?
Okay, thanks, Helen. So maybe, I think, Warren, you got 2 of those, so I'll start with you.
The answer to the first 2 questions is I don't know and I don't know. This is really work in progress, and the problem is, and surprisingly, if we've been focused on the extent to which a major effort at the city level for low carbon, climate resilient city development could have an impact big enough to actually bend the GHG curve, and I firmly believe that's possible. The amount of information available out there is very, very little in terms of what are the opportunities, how do you structure the deals, what are the costs, what are the returns, rates of return, and so we're not in a position yet to, we've done some models so that we can at least talk to pension funds and sovereign funds and others, but there's really a shortage of information on what these deals would look like, let alone looking at the broader infrastructure and services requirements that these cities need anyway, with or without climate change. So I think this is just beginning. I do think the leveraging that what we've seen in the Clean Technology Fund has been about 10 to 1 on low carbon, either renewables, energy efficiency, or or clean transport, and about $3 of that is private sector flows. And that's without trying. So I'm convinced you can mobilize, if you actually try, you can actually do a pretty good job of mobilizing private sector monies. But this is work in progress. And it's, I'm frustrated with how slowly it's moving. If I can just but watch this space. I think that within the next few months we'll have a better answer for that. To me, the political levers are, or the key political levers are information. The knowledge around these issues is so weak, and I wish I could say that if we had if we could package the 4-degree world work that's been going on and take it as a knowledge product to the UNFCCC negotiations, that they would all of a sudden get over the issues they've had for 20 years. I don't believe that. But I do believe that this kind of knowledge is adequate to bring like-minded parties together to tackle these key issues in parallel to, and hopefully demonstration how the international community can come together and deal with the issues. So I think very much the issue is a better understanding. The science has improved on a lot of these issues. The health arguments are great for this. I mean, there's all kinds of examples where better knowledge tells you what to do on that. So I think that's the key issue as far as I'm concerned.
So Graham or Dermot, did you want to comment on the politics question, how you get, I guess, policy cooperation?
So look, and I think if I stick on the Mekong, because I think it's a good example of the potential of this, and it comes to Warren's point about knowledge. The work that ABB have done over the last decade, which has involved the Chinese, which is really important because of their critical role that they have played in the ADB relationship outside of the Mekong River Commission structure for regional collaboration, is around getting a better knowledge and understanding and turning this into understanding there's a common problem that the Chinese need to be involved in solving, and that the countries need to be involved in solving, particularly some of the downstream impacts of development of dams and things like that. So bringing good economics, social sciences and good environmental science into better development planning, hence the sort of broader vision that ADB have been developing for the Mekong, is quite important in getting a common understanding of the problem that helps build some knowledge towards some better collaboration and solutions.
Politics clearly important. If you look at general standards on radioactivity and you have an accident, whether it be in the Soviet Union or Japan, there are very different ways of dealing with it and who actually did it best. Or in the case of SARS, different regimes in China or Hong Kong or in different parts of the Mekong compared with North America or Australia, where people said, why should I bother with these rules and regulations? You can only work within the political constraints, even though your goals are similar. Similarly, how do you deal with certain countries in the Mekong region deal very, very severely with pharmacists who are found to be selling either fake drugs or incorrect drugs that are increasing our problem of resistance? Other places tolerate it, and in other countries actually continue to make drugs that we know are not very effective and therefore contribute to the problem. I agree, it's just a huge challenge. And once again, how do you get a global agreement on what they should be? So that, for example, the African leaders sign up to a scorecard as to what percentage of children sleep under a bed net or pregnant when in bed. They have an annual scorecard and they compare what each other's doing. That would not be possible in some other environments.
And Kazu, perhaps, I mean, you may want to comment on that too, but perhaps you could take Chris's question.
This benefit issue,
yeah.
Who is benefiting? I think different parties are benefiting. For example, the reason why I mentioned the history of this region about past conflicts is that through this kind of joint program, they can improve their relationship. And by jointly working, they know each other. There is a much higher level of mutual trust, but also the common interest in working together. So as I said, even today we are seeing even some armed skirmishes between member countries of this group. But if such incident happens, in the vacuum without this kind of joint work, probably situation would have been much more serious. So this is contributing to stability and peace in the region, but at more closer to development and aid issue, this is also benefiting poor countries. If you look at the series of road projects, in the case of China, Thailand, maybe they are benefiting more from these improved connectivity by increased level of trade. But also countries like Cambodia, Laos, poorer members of the group, are benefiting from this regional connectivity in sort of raising platform for their development, growth, and poverty reduction. For example, there is one major project in Greater Mekong sub-region, and that is improvement of transport system linking Da Nang port of Da Nang in Vietnam to port of Moromie in Myanmar. So this road cuts through Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. And between Laos and Thailand, there is a new bridge constructed over Mekong River. And Laos side of this corridor is called a province called Savannakhet. Now, after completion of this project, the poverty incidence in this Savannakhet province dropped by 30% within 5 years. And per capita income in this province increased from $370 to $425 within 5 years. And this is much faster than average figure for Laos as a whole. So certainly these regional projects maybe are benefiting better off people in these countries, but also poor people in these countries. Thank you.
We're close to being out of time. If there are one or two brief questions, we might take those. Otherwise, yes, Alison.
This is really interesting. I mean, to some extent, we're also taking a little bit of license with the sort of strict definition of what's a public good. But hey, I'm a pragmatist, and I think we just have to do that. I suppose my question is if we take license and think about the issues you were raising, Warren, and also you, Dermot, is a internationally credible carbon price a public good? And how do we get it?
Okay, and last question over here.
Thanks. It's really more a comment, maybe a question to save time, but I was just thinking of Graham's slide with all the players that are involved in rollback malaria. And I'm just, I guess, posing the issue that have we, in fact, in the interests of global collaboration, really created a monster in the fact that the numbers, certainly in the health area, the stage is extremely crowded, that the number of bodies that seek to be involved and want to have a hand in this. And I guess it's just perhaps preempting the next session, but, have we really created this monster that is... The process is actually overtaken the outcome.
Okay, Warren, do you want to decide whether a carbon price is a global public good?
Well, I'm not too hung up on what a global public good is and isn't. But yes, we need without a carbon price, without a value on carbon, it's going to be hard to deal with this problem. And there's some good things happening in a number of countries and parts of a number of countries. But in the long term, if there's not a value put on carbon, the same as if there's not a value put on ecosystems and all the other things that are under threat because of the way the world's going and the consumption patterns and so on, if you don't value these things, then they're not going to be saved or they're going to get worse. Could I just comment on the last? My view is we're not crowded enough. Thank you.
Not much to add, really, except to say that I think it is better to try and bring all the players together. I think there are too many people doing their own thing who are not able to be coordinated, and I think it places incredible stress on the countries who might have 50 different organisations wanting to do AIDS in country X. And if the countries somehow could bring the players together as well and insist that they have a common purpose, that would add to what's coming from above to do it. But we really do need, these are really major problems, the drug resistance, and we really have to work together, and there's a very big risk that we could go backwards. So it has to be there, it's probably the best we have, and we don't want to just create another organisation, but try and get coordination if we can.
And just maybe to add on that, so I agree with Warren on his comments on a global price on carbon. But to say, I think one of the challenges as we do, and I think over the next decade we will get increasingly close towards that situation. One of the challenges is in planning for that's probably not going to help the poorest countries and the poorest in those countries to get access to energy. So I think part of the financing discussion, which I think is critical as we move towards that, is how do you make sure that countries that will never really ever get the type of private public sector financing to do this, how do you get them up at the same time as the global mechanisms do that?
Okay, thanks very much. We'll end here. I won't try and wrap all of that up, but just a couple of quick observations, I guess, in the framework that I set out at the beginning. So even if you accept that aid can and should be used for international public goods, and even if you accept that more of it should be spent on that, I think the presentations from the panel members have highlighted a whole lot of other things that would have to happen as well. First, much more substantial mobilisation of private resources, whether that's through leveraging or whether it's through bringing down the cost of essential drugs in developing countries. So the private sector angle is important. The importance of the provision of complementary national and regional public goods, which Graham highlighted, but also Kazu. And then the importance of recognising domestic action in developing countries. Some of the things that happen under a country's own steam within its borders to increase energy efficiency or engage in low-cost drug production, these in themselves are very important contributions to international public goods, regardless of whether there's any aid money involved. And then finally, the point about, I guess, knocking heads together, whether you're talking about within the grouping of multilateral organisations or in much broader coalitions of the Coral Triangle type, it's essential to bring all of the players together in a way that puts them all on the same page in order to ensure that, and I think Kazu's comments on infrastructure financing through MDBs, it's a perfect example. It's an area where the G20 has seen a need, has begun to address it, but as he says, has in fact let the issue drift for the last couple of years. So those are just four, I guess, additional points that I drew from the panel's presentations.